Yeah, salvation is I often think of it like a multifaceted jewel in Luke's gospel. It's associated with not only things like the forgiveness of sin, eternal life or life eternal, but it's also associated with liberation from oppression, like demonic oppression, and status reversal of the high being brought low and low being brought high, with social restoration also from people in the margins being brought to the center, and a kind of a wide variety of righting of wrongs.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Welcome back if you're a normal listener, or hey, thanks for being here if this is your first time. I'm Jarrett, I'm the host. Today's guest is Troy Troftgruben. I will keep this as short as possible. So, if you're listening for free, like and subscribe, rate wherever it is that you listen. Head on over to any one of the, dozen of social media platforms that we're on. YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, Blue Sky, Spoutable, Threads, Twitter. There's a WordPress up where the episodes get posted. There's a Tumblr for the podcast. There's just a ton of different places that you can follow either the episodes or news about the episodes. So please do that and give me feedback, guest suggestions, tips on interviewing, possible subjects, places that you would like me to explore that don't necessarily fit within the constraints of long form conversations about biblical texts. If you haven't heard it, I do have an interview with Adrian Tchaikovsky that is neither theological nor biblical studies centered. He is a fantasy and sci-fi author, and we talk about all the things that could be packed into fantasy or sci-fi novels that he does a great job of packing in there. If you want to go that ultimate final step, $5 a month on Patreon, that is the ideal outcome, is that people will like what they hear. They'll want to support the podcast. And if enough of you do that, this could become my day job, which I would love. I love reading and I love talking to people and learning more. So I said I'd keep this short. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Troy Troftgruben. Thanks. Troy Troftgruben, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. It's a joy to be here.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Troy Troftgruben. I teach at Wartburg Theological Seminary in Dubuque, Iowa, where I teach New Testament in Greek and some integrative stuff. But generally, I've been here for about a dozen years, and before that served as a pastor, a Lutheran pastor for 5 years. And I have a particular interest, throughout the New Testament, but especially Luke and Acts, where I kind of hang my hat if there's a place to be hung. And so, yeah.
Well, and that's fortunately where you've hung your hat is where we're going to be camped out today. So we're going to be discussing your Journal of Biblical Literature article, The Time It Takes, Prolonged Pace in Luke's Travel Narrative, 951 through 1944. And just to kick us off, what is the relevance of time and pacing in Luke's narrative in that portion of the gospel?
Yeah. So it's an area that I've always found intriguing, especially just by virtue of the way it takes so long for Jesus to get from where he begins the journey to Jerusalem, especially in chapters 9 to 19. At the end of the day, the language of pace, as I'm using it here, borrowing especially from Gerard Genet, but others use it too. That's kind of the reference of how long story time happens versus how long of text time, that is, how much space is dedicated to narrating something versus how much time actually transpires in that amount of text. That makes sense?
No, absolutely. So I know a lot of us have the Lord of the Rings in our head through the movies, and And while it does depict this is happening over a period of time, because it when you're watching it, it happens over a matter of hours rather than, well, for me, those books would take months to read because I'm a slow reader, but they really do build in that it's months and months. It's 10 years from the journey even beginning. And so I think you're saying here in the text, it's not just an as the crow flies time frame to get from one place to another.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, to your knowledge, who first noticed that that was a relevant factor in these narratives?
Yeah. And so it wasn't, I mean, to my knowledge, it doesn't become a thing until first New Testament scholars begin to get around to the idea and embrace the idea that Mark wrote first. And in view of that, Luke must have used Mark. And that's when it really accentuates things. There's a long-standing theory that Matthew wrote first, and that produces its own kind of thinking about what the shape of Luke's story looks like. But once it started to become a bit of a mainstream idea that Mark wrote first, Mark's a lot shorter than Luke's gospel, and that Luke and Matthew might have used Mark, then that really accentuates just how different Luke's journey narrative. And that's about in the early 1800s when it really starts to get traction, proposed in the late 1700s. But so to your question, I mean, so Friedrich Schleiermacher is one of the earliest to note it and reflect on Luke's long pace or long journey in the early 1800s. J. Leonard Hugh is another who has an introduction to the New Testament, who has a lovely line. When we were thinking to see Jesus soon in Jerusalem, we unexpectedly find him elsewhere, and in fact further away from Jerusalem than at the commencement of his journey. So by the early 1800s, folks are noticing it and thinking about it in different ways of why Luke's is so much longer than Mark. You know, Mark's journey to Jerusalem is about 2 chapters long. Luke's is about 10. That's a big difference. So that's enough to get people thinking about what Luke's doing there.
Are the factors that we see, the factors that are noticed by Schleiermacher and yourself and others, are those things that exist throughout the gospel, or are they specific to this narrative chunk that we're discussing today?
Yeah, it's distinctive to this section here of Luke's journey to Jerusalem, although there are pieces throughout Luke's gospel that are distinctive, interesting. You know, for example, the way that the language of today that shows up, and clear reference to salvation, that's interesting language that shows up, or the way that Luke portrays a faithful response is associated with joy and also associated with sharing of resources. So those are distinctive aspects. But this kind of the shifting of pace is distinctive, I think, to the travel narrative of Luke 9 to 19. I mean, nowhere else in Luke's gospel is, I think, this kind of slowdown of time quite as palpable. The Passion narrative has some of it. Some of the early chapters of Luke maybe has some of it, but this is a long section for this to happen. We see other signs of it in Acts and kind of some different sections there, but it's distinctive to the travel narrative, I guess, is what ultimately when I'm speaking to your question.
Okay. And so you mentioned salvation in the Gospel of Luke. How is salvation characterized in the Gospel of Luke, and is it unique when compared to the other Gospels?
Yeah, salvation is I often think of it like a multifaceted jewel in Luke's gospel. It's associated with not only things like the forgiveness of sin, eternal life or life eternal, but it's also associated with liberation from oppression, like demonic oppression, and status reversal of the high being brought low and low being brought high, with social restoration also from people in the margins being brought to the center, and a kind of a wide variety of righting of wrongs. Language that's been used by some scholars is salvation in Luke involves or is deeply associated with status reversal. And I think you see that in Mary's Magnificat words of the high being brought low, the low being brought high. So that doesn't mean it's also not forgiveness of sin and eternal life in kind of traditional categories, but more than even other places in other gospels, I think Luke expands and fleshes out the full dimensions of salvation. And Luke uses the language of Savior for Jesus throughout Luke's gospel too. So there's a clear intentionality to it. And salvation is a big deal and is pretty multifaceted in many writings of the New Testament. I don't want to deny that, but I think it's one of the fullest portrayals of anywhere in the New Testament is what we find in Luke's writings, especially Luke's gospel.
I think it's a tough concept because there's already a notion in most people's heads when
Mm.
they engage with a biblical text about it. So it's a little bit difficult to correct that and see it within a narrative as anything but centering, um, I guess, a divine dissatisfaction with human morality, and that being the challenge that's being overcome. But you're saying here there are more factors involved.
Yeah. In fact, a good story that comes to my mind when I think about this, it's a text that many of my New Testament classes we spend some time on, is the story of Zacchaeus, who is a rich tax collector. And a traditional reading of it is that he has this encounter with Jesus, and in the process of it has somewhat spontaneous response of generosity that he turns that he goes through a change. Some people would say he has a conversion experience, and the response Jesus says is, "Today salvation has come to this house." But there are other aspects as we look closer. And we also realize that some of the verbs used for Zacchaeus' response are present tense, which could suggest maybe a push, but it could suggest it's actually ongoing activity of generosity that he's not new to. It's not a sudden thing. It's the crowd that thinks so ill of him. We don't necessarily know that Zacchaeus was a dirtbag, and he's just really has an unfavorable impression with the crowd. And in the process, Jesus going to his house and saying, "Today salvation's come to this house," also restores him to community and to society. So there's more going on than simply, I don't know, I don't know what the language would be to use to have kind of an epiphany moment of Zacchaeus with God. There's a lot going on in this salvation coming to his house, and it's important to dwell on just the fullness of it rather than boil it down to one item.
And that aspect of an ongoing or perpetual state kind of fits in, like your article seems to be centering discipleship,
Hmm.
to bring it back to your article and not just follow everything that seems interesting to me. So where is discipleship situated in the narrative of Luke's gospel, in your
Yeah,
opinion?
yeah. I think teaching on discipleship, although it happens throughout the ministry of Jesus, throughout Luke's gospel, it really is centered, especially on the travel narrative. When it begins in Luke 9:51, he sets his face to go to Jerusalem, and then for nearly 10 chapters, he makes his way there to Jerusalem. And during those chapters, there's just a rich repertoire of teaching, especially parables. The focus, or at least an audience for his teachings, among other audiences, especially, is the disciples. And a number of the teachings reflect on and engage what does it mean to live faithfully in the present moment. So it seems like I don't want to quite use the language of it's a grab bag place for a lot of Jesus teachings on discipleship and Luke, but it certainly is a concentrated section. And that's where the focus comes into his teachings, and disciples are coming to clear focus than I think anywhere else in the narrative.
So discipleship is another word that I think there's a lot of preconceived notions about.
Hmm.
Like specifically, it's an idea that is exclusively religious in our understanding, like where it may have a broader place, like a place in the broader culture, it still, I think, has an attachment to its place in religion. How is it? Okay,
Hmm.
are there words specifically, say, in the Greek text that point to, or that, sorry, that are rendered as disciple or discipleship when we read them in English? And is there a helpful understanding of those words that may, I don't know, decenter the religious and theological priors that people approach the text with?
Yeah, that's a good question. Although, I mean, the language is used like of disciples, of following Disciples, the word mathetes is Greek, or following, akulotheo is another Greek word used to follow Jesus. And those words are used. But I think when I think of the travel narrative, I mean, specific language that really is used to a greater degree is the language of journey, which is, I think, for Luke, a bit of a key word or a word of rich significance for following Jesus. Even though the word itself just means to travel or to go, poreomai, it's a more colorful word than the more common word used in the New Testament for just to go somewhere. Erchomai is that word. So it's a little bit richer, has a little bit more significance, in this case, kind of a theological significance. And the way Luke uses it shows up, the language shows up to a much greater degree. And the travel narrative suggests that it's like a metaphor for what it means to follow Jesus. Discipleship in Luke is a journey. It's one that is holistic, it's transformative, and once you set out, you're never the same again. I think it's parallel to the ways in the book of Acts, Luke's other volume, the language of the way is used as symbolic, or not symbolic, it's a word used to refer to the church, and it has a significance to it that suggests something, it's not just a title, suggests that the community is a group of people on the way. And so in both cases, it shows discipleship as going somewhere and being on a journey that's going to change people and communities, that's following Jesus, and it will alter who they are as they go.
Okay. Thank you. That was helpful. And I kind of wanted to establish some of those things to maybe break some repetition that might be in people's heads, or a habit that might be in people's heads around those terms or concepts, before we dig into what is substantively the meat of your article. So you address these aspects in part one of the article, and I'll read them off, and I can kind of help stay in the list if you need me to. But so you identify length, ambiguous geography, prevalence of discourse, grammatical features, and parallels with Paul's journey to Rome. Do you mind taking us through those and why those are significant here?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. So the length, and I've already named that already, but Jesus' journey to Jerusalem in Luke's Gospel, Luke 9 to 19, is over 400 verses, which is over a third of Luke's narrative, making it roughly as long as Paul's letter to the Romans is, about 400 verses. And you compare it to Mark's journey of Jesus to Jerusalem, it's just about 100 verses. So that's pretty distinctive on its own. That's what really first caught my attention, has caught many people's attention. But as you look closer, the other things, like there is an ambiguous geography. Most of if you look hard for the geographical references in Luke's travel narrative, you're going to be hard pressed to find them. The only clear references are at the start, Samaria, and then near the end, like within a chapter of arriving, is Jericho. And in between, there's a lot of nothing. There are a lot of indefinite references to, like, Jesus was in a certain village, a certain place, a certain home. That's really creates an ambiguity to the experience. Where is he by this point? 5-6 chapters in. There's a great deal of teaching. Teaching takes the front seat and puts geography in the back seat. It creates some parallels to sort of the wilderness wanderings of Israel in the Old Testament, where the focus just in the biblical writings shifts to teaching versus getting somewhere. And there are a host of parables. Some of those well-known parables in Luke show up in this section, as well as meal settings that are all a part of it. In the nitty-gritty, grammatical features. So get your Greek on here. Here's a few points, but there's a construction with an articular infinitive, ento plus that shows up quite a bit. That typically refers to while this is going on, other activity happens. There's imperfect verbs and present participles, and there's genitive absolute constructions. All these are really subtle, but they are constructions used to show kind of ongoing activity, to kind of lift up this activity and layer an activity on top of other activity. It's subtle, but I think it enhances the ongoingness of the journey. And finally, then, the parallels with Paul's journey to Rome in Acts, which is also a story that takes longer than you would expect it needs to. 8 chapters for Paul once he says he's going to get there, for him finally to arrive at Rome. But yet the scenes on the way are important. So, I mean, all this, to use a phrase that's pretty common in today's language, they really suggest that the journey is as important, maybe more important, than the destination.
So a thing that I've long, I don't know, tried to wrap my head around is, I think because I came from a like a literalist tradition in reading biblical text, this was very difficult for me when I was late teens, early 20s. But there's a, I guess I'll just be reductive and say there's a theological motivation to why the gospel writers are doing what they're doing in certain times. And that's not to discredit it at all and to say that it's untrue. So the geography doesn't matter. And the first thing that came to mind, and I don't remember if he did this specifically, but this is the kind of thing that you read in a modern or contemporary history. So like Robert Caro's Years of Lyndon Johnson biographies,
Hmm.
he may start a chapter out talking about the radio station that the Johnsons owned in Austin or in the Texas Hill
Hmm.
Country. And he may have to go backward to explain how that came to be in order to move forward, or Diarmid McCulloch in his History of the Reformation has to talk about people who came before Martin Luther to give you the context of Martin Luther's significance and what he's saying. So here's some material on Jan Hus, and I think we're used to that. But this is an equally, I guess, creative way of dealing with information, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are good comparisons.
Thank you. Okay, that'll be all. No, I just, yeah. As soon as you praise me, we're done. I don't need any. So there's a stylistic approach to making a theological point that overlaps with, I guess we'll say, an historical point as well, right? And there may be more in there, so please add to that if there's more to it.
Yeah, I think you're narrowing in exactly on reasons why we may or may not think about some of these questions, or why there may be some hesitancies about the questions. It relates to questions of history and how Luke is relating history. Um, and I think, I mean, on this point, and these are valid questions and considerations, um, but something I think about is, I'm really going to generalize here, but it's I think it's fair to say it's our sense that whereas today the standards we have for like relating history, and we have some standards and assumptions about, we strive for objectivity. We strive for, if you're going to relate historical events, to try to relate them as objectively, as accurately as possible. And those criteria were also present for the ancients as well, for Luke and many other history writers. Luke is writing at least some kind of history writing as he understands it. But at the same time, the criteria were a little different for the ancients, and perhaps to a degree a bit greater than maybe even today. I mean, it's debatable. Uh, giving a narrative or a story, a rhetorical point, and having it hold together coherently were genuine virtues for history writing and biography, to a degree that may be a little bit different. We look for different things today. That is, it was kind of pointless to tell a story unless it had a point and it had the story held together. We, in post-Enlightenment people, sometimes value sort of objectivity and kind of scientific relating of things to a degree that I think is just foreign to what the ancients were looking for. I think that frees us up simply to receive Luke's story without wedding, I don't know, without associating any kind of artistic or literary craft or literary artistry we find in Luke's writings, without tethering it too immediately to questions of factuality and history in ways that I think Luke's audience and Luke himself would not have quite have assumed.
I mean, look, I can say even as a fan of history, I am someone who enjoys reading history. I am genuinely shocked when when a very readable history comes my way. So, for example, I mean, I've talked about this book before, but Tom Holland's Rubicon, when
Hmm.
people talk about, I'm having a conversation with somebody just day to day, and we'll be talking about history, and, men think about ancient Rome every day. So obviously I've made this book recommendation, but I'm like short of the dialogue, that book reads like a novel. Like, even if you don't like reading, there's a very good chance that you will find that book engaging. And I think even someone like myself, sitting down and reading a history book that's not particularly artfully uh, written, I could just, okay, yeah, no, I mean, that's the cost of doing business.
Hmm.
But it doesn't seem like that necessarily was the case in the ancient world, that like the materials and the time and the skill were all so expensive in the context of people in the ancient world, that like you kind of had to put your best foot forward if you were going to use the ink and the and the vellum, or whatever it was you were using. Is that fair to say that is part of what's happening here as well?
Yeah, you're right to bring up the expense. I I related, but a little bit well. I'll just say in questions, for example, about the preface to Luke, when who is Theophilus, who's addressed at the start, and while the questions remain about that, and it's brought up that Theophilus means lover of God, and so while the proposal is really fair to consider, is the audience as envisioned more of a generic lover of God? At the end of the day, someone likely had to give Luke the resources to undertake this work because it was expensive. It required access to resources, access to materials, access to time, and all these things. It was a significant undertaking to write any narrative in antiquity to a degree that we who write on Microsoft Word on our computers or whatever don't appreciate quite as fully.
And the fact that it still exists, right? Because we're not talking about, it's not like all the New Testament scholars go to a central museum and you look at the original copy that just happens to have been preserved. Like, additional people were, scribes were using the same or similar resources to make sure that this thing carried on or was spread out, or a copy could go over there. So that's important too. And I bring all of that up because I noticed one of my questions, and I don't know if you reviewed them, but if you did, the question where I said, "Is it possible that the appearance of the travel narrative being a metaphor for discipleship is coincidental?"
Yeah.
I, that's one of those questions I worry, like, man, I hope he doesn't think I'm just like some dumb reductive jerk who's asking this question, because I know that may seem that way, but like, is this is are there indications in the text that this is on purpose?
Yeah. Yeah, I love the question. Since that possibly your whole
Okay.
argument is just a figment of our imagination. That's kind of the $1 million question, that comes underneath this too. And while the truth be told, I can't guarantee, like staked on my life, that it is no accident. I think there are some really clear signs because we don't have Luke's intentions are unavailable to us. All we have are what he's written. So we cannot know Luke's intentions for certain. What we do have is though his stories are before us, and there's some clear evidence that something really clear and cohesive is there, like the amount of, the vast length of Luke's travel narrative here, the language of journey, or poreomai, the Greek word that shows up. We have nearly a third of the New Testament references are in Luke and Acts, or excuse me, over half are in Luke and Acts, but nearly a third of Luke's references are in this section. So there's a high percentage of that language. And I do think it's pretty, by most any standard, I think it's virtually undeniable just by reading Luke and Acts to that Luke likes travel. When you read Acts, there's travel that shows up quite a bit. Paul's journeys, the church spreading out, witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and the ends of the earth. So there's a geographical progression that's at the heart of that story. So it's more pronounced in Acts than Luke's gospel. But that also colors our thinking about Luke if we do assume the two writings are by the same person. And it informs our thinking about the ways such attention is given to Jesus' travel. At the end of the day, 10 chapters to get to Jerusalem versus 2. That says a lot in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, unless you're I guess it would be one thing if you're specifically telling every story all along the way and giving very clear indications that, like, oh, in this town, this thing, this thing, this thing, this thing. But the episodes are all clearly directed at a point that while they're fit within the travel, the travel is it's just like a case that's carrying it, right? The travel is that chunk of the narrative, but it's not the point of the narrative, right?
Uh, in one sense, no, because it's the teaching what happens on the way. But you're right. Arriving at the destination is not the point of the narrative. The experience of the travel itself is important. One other comparison comes to my mind too, and I think about this is so there are places like in Acts. I have a tough time coming up with it in Luke, although there might be a few references. But there are places like in Acts where travel is narrated very succinctly and very quickly. Like early on, well, it's not early on, it's before Paul starts, as soon into, before he's going to get on his journey to Jerusalem, when he travels from Troas to Miletus in Acts 20:13 to 16. It's pretty bare bones. It's 4 verses. Then they went here, then they stopped here, and then they went here, and they arrived here. So clearly Luke can do that if he wishes to. We don't get that in Luke 10 to 19. We have a lot more elaboration and a lot more suspense, I guess, on the way.
So is it possible that the different, we'll call them episode, actually I'll say pericope just because I want to see if the AI that transcribes the podcast gets that right. It'll probably be parakeet or something.
Or
um
Periscope.
yeah. Or just blanks. That these different episodes are they, the things that happen along the way, are they placed or structured or ordered or however you want to characterize it in a way that suggests, like, oh, there's a point being made here, that it doesn't matter where they happened or what order they may have actually taken place, they're put in this structure for this reason, like they're building toward the denouement. Does that matter?
In Luke's travel narrative,
Yes.
some scenes, a lot of folks have looked really carefully and closely at trying to give a structure to the travel narrative, and it's seems, at least at this point, like it's defied really a clear consensus, I guess. So that suggests it's not the most clear, why this piece here, why this piece here. At least the different varieties of structures, I think, suggest some, I don't know, some complexity to the story, which that's not a bad thing. I think it's Walt Willimon has a quote that says along the lines of, if a story can be reduced to one point, then it's not a very good story. So this is a kind of complex progression that moves in. However, there are a few benchmarks that are significant and seem very important, like Luke 13:31 to 35, when Jesus is told by the Pharisees to stay away from here. Herod wants to kill you, and he refuses. A prophet cannot die outside Jerusalem, and so he speaks of his journey as today. I'm healing and casting out demons today and tomorrow, and on the third day we'll reach my destination. So it seems to be a very clear tagline or benchmark halfway, roughly, to say Jesus has an intentional journey. It's going to take an intentional amount of time, and he's going to get there, and he has to. So there are some key moments, but other points along the way, it's part of the journey, and with a little less clear geographical anchoring.
So I know it's a separate thing because this is Hebrew Bible, but Brendan Hurlbert had an article about Judges, and he was kind of questioning this, downward spiral. Things are building toward a more and more evil Israel in the Book of Judges, and he kind of compares it to it's more like the Twilight Zone or Black Mirror in that it's just vignettes within a mortal universe. And I'm not saying you're saying that exactly, but that's what I was reminded of while you were answering that. It's just like, no, it doesn't necessarily all have to be building toward that. Even though the travel does end in Jerusalem, there isn't necessarily a reason that the things that happen are all structured in the way that they are. Is that does that make sense?
Yeah, I love that analogy. It's kind of fun to think about, to consider. Uh, Frankly, yeah, you summarized what I said earlier well. Yeah, um, and at the same time, I also want to admit that I think there may be aspects I just haven't considered to the fullest extent of pieces in the structure. I think there are some places, like a passage that comes to my mind is um, the parable of the widow and the unjust judge. It's getting kind of near the end. They're approaching Jerusalem, and it's used, or the frame that Luke gives it describes it as a story that Jesus tells to encourage faithfulness um, in the present moment. Um, Sorry, I just find it kind of right in front of me here, but or excuse me, chapter 18 is what I said. And will, as he reflects on, will the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? There are some parables, especially in chapter 17 and 18, that shift to thinking about um, faithfulness in the meantime, in the present moment, versus a focus on the eschaton, or the parousia, or the return of Jesus. And that does become more pronounced towards the end of the journey. And it seems, I mean, there are a number of writings that narrow in deeper on this. John Carroll and some others have really explored this. But that seems to be an intentional piece coming towards the end of the journey to Jerusalem, I think perhaps. But at the end of the day, to return to what you said earlier, some of the aspects and the order and progression in which they appear in Luke's travel there aren't the clearest, at least to the point of a consensus among interpreters.
So this is not exclusive to this portion, and I try not to talk too much about other scholars' work necessarily, but I remember reading Kenneth Bailey years ago, and he had this kind of like rule of threes thing about stories that had like chunks of stories that happen in Luke. Is that true? I don't know that I've read that anywhere but him. So specifically, just for the listeners' benefit, this book that I'm thinking of, it's about Luke 15, and so the structure of Luke 15 is like the Pharisees come to him. Why are you hanging out with prostitutes and tax collectors? And his answer comes in, and I forget the order, but this woman lost her coin, this shepherd lost his sheep, and then this the story of the prodigal son, and that those are all a single answer to that thing. Is that a commonality? And look, if you it has nothing to do with your
I love it.
article, it's just a structural thing in Luke that I'm curious about, so you can say pass. But is that a thing that's in there?
That's a great question. I appreciate Kenneth Bailey's work. He informed some of my own thinking on this too. Luke 15 is a good example of that certainly supports the idea. And I also think about in Luke 11 when Jesus is invited to teach his disciples how to pray, and he gives the Lord's Prayer, but then also gives kind of two little teaching sections: one a parable and prayer, and then talks about ask and it will be given to you. And that might also fit the pattern there too. Um, I haven't thought about it in the patterns of triads, but I want to look for that. I'm charged with starting to work on a commentary on Luke's gospel, so I hope by the end of writing that thing, I'm going to have a more definitive answer, at least my own conclusion to the question. And I want to look for that. It's not prevalently known enough that it's like widespread consensus. That makes me skeptical, but yet also Luke 15 is supportive of it. And Kenneth Bailey has some pretty insightful observations on things. So I want to ponder it.
Okay, well, I'll definitely pick up that commentary to get that answer.
Got to write the
I'll,
thing first.
if there's a Kindle format, I'll buy that so I can Control F to see, does he say no, Jared? It's not right, or yeah, Jared, you can run with that. Um, yeah, no, that's just when thinking of the structural stuff that's happening in Luke. That was an interesting thing that I'd not thought of in years, and I figured I'd just go on record asking a question about it. Um, how I guess Luke specifically as a gospel, how would you compare travel representation in? We'll just limit it to this chunk of Luke 9 to 19 with other ancient texts that depict travel as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. Before we just focus on one thing and judge everything based on that, how does it compare to other literature? And so, yeah, I contend that Luke's portrays travel here as a metaphor for discipleship. It's reflective and capturing a lot of things, the importance to what discipleship looks like in Luke. So is this different from other places? Yes and no. On the one hand, it's not unique in ancient literature to portray travel as like a test of character or a challenge that someone goes through that yields some merit on its own. Like Plutarch's Lives, I think, show people going through life experiences that involve travel and that somehow it's formative to who they are. I also think about ancient novels from prose fiction in antiquity, where travel is almost always a central component, and that it often becomes the challenge to overcome. People want to try to typically return home to safety, and so there's some metaphorical, there's a significance to the travel in these stories. So in that sense, Luke, I think, is not unique. However, I think he is unique in the way that, the journey of following Jesus in Luke's gospel, for example, is not simply a test of character, like to show one's manliness or whatever, as you find in some biography in the ancient world, but instead it's an experience of not, I'm going to use this kind of conventional, of becoming manly and such, but rather of relinquishing conventional um, manly qualities of initiative and aggressiveness, and instead to become a follower of Jesus. I do think it's different that a lot of uses of travel as kind of a metaphor of significance in ancient writings, it's usually a character test that people go through. And in Luke, it's kind of, but it's more so a transformation of learning how to follow Jesus and put the cross at the center, as opposed to becoming better and better as a person. So they're similar, but Luke has a theology that's focused on the cross, which other writings don't. I also think about, unlike like ancient novels where travel is a bit of an obstacle to overcome, people set out, all these things happen, these folks have to overcome them and somehow get back home to safety. Unlike that, the goal here in Luke and certainly in Acts is not to return home to safety. It's rather to embrace the journey as transformative, because and as something from which there's no going back. So especially in Acts, you'll be my witnesses, and that spreads out. And people are not to return to the same old, same old. It's rather to embrace the transformation that's involved in the journey, and it's one that involves naming Jesus as Lord and as bearing witness to that confession or message.
So, is there a sense that the narrative of the gospel leading up to this point, is it like a journey in and of itself to get to the point where the travel begins, or how do you see that? Like Luke 1 through 950.
Yeah, it's an experience, and places are play a role, um, but there isn't quite action in motion to the degree that we find in Luke 9 to 19. Jesus, there's a lot centered on Jesus' sort of origins, the infancy narrative in the early chapters, his call to ministry, and his beginning to call disciples and teach. But there's less focus on movement. There's some of it, but it doesn't seem to have quite the centrality, the way that it so governs 9 to 19. And we get the impression Luke's Jesus never sits down, so to speak. He's always on the move. And I think you could contend, or at least get the impression, you have some stationary stopping points as more prevalent in the early chapters.
Okay, that's a helpful answer. Okay, so we're about 40 minutes. I like to start to shift things toward conclusion because I want to spend a lot of time on these last few questions, if that's needed. What from the article were you hoping I would ask about that I have not asked about so far?
uh, you asked some of the great questions. It's kind of fun. Um, you should ask about parallels between travel between Luke and Acts. That'd be fun. And then how do New Testament? I might suggest do other New Testament texts portray discipleship differently than Luke?
Do they?
Yeah.
How so?
Um, I think about, so in comparing the Gospels, that's what I just stick with because they're all narratives. You'd think that you might have a kind of a similar portrayal of discipleship. They're basically following the same general story. So that's where you'd most expect to find sort of parallel portrayals. And although it's the same core story underneath them all, I think I like to think of a core metaphor for discipleship that actually appears in each of the four Gospels. I've already talked about Luke's being one of a journey, travel. It's in this, and it's one of following Jesus. And that's, I think, kind of the basic picture of what discipleship looks like. It's setting out on a journey, and there's no going back. And like any travel that we experience today, we go somewhere. At some level, we are changed. Unless we're thoroughly oblivious to what we go through and pay attention to nothing, it changes us. We are, our cultural worlds are challenged, our learning is informed, and the like. But to put in comparison to others, like it, whereas Matthew's is a much more, it's a portrayal, I think, of learning, discipleship in a more traditional or conventional kind of learning from the master teacher. Jesus is clearly a teacher in Matthew. And although there's an action reflection model to that teaching, the disciples are sent out, they're invited to step out of the boat, they're invited to do things as they learn. It's still clearly Jesus is the teacher par excellence, and the disciples are learners. So it takes a little bit more of a conventional kind of teaching learning uh, portrayal, with Jesus being the master teacher. So kind of a Jesus as teacher and disciples as learners. Mark's gospel, I think, has the disciples as following Jesus rather blindly. They, even by the end of the gospel, they don't necessarily understand fully or clearly who Jesus is, but they keep following until they abandon him, I guess, in the garden. But still, the general portrayal is of following Jesus, whether or not one fully understands. I think it's blind faith is kind of a good example to that. The disciples embody it to a degree, and yet there are others in the margins, women and others, that come around and see and understand Jesus more clearly. So, despite whether one understands or not, there's a metaphor of following, different than travel, like in Luke, and of following blindly and trying one's best to understand and to keep following Jesus, who's faithful to them. Finally, John, I think it's a metaphor of question and answer dialogue with Jesus. We see it in people like the woman at the well, Nicodemus, Thomas, man born blind, who all engage Jesus in dialogue and ask some pressing questions, some skeptical questions, and they receive answers that are profound, that also invite them to a state of deeper faith, to make statements ultimately that are some of the greatest confessions of faith in John's gospel. So, in short, I think, all these have really different kinds of emphases to what discipleship looks like. And it puts, I think it draws attention to the distinctiveness of Luke and the journey metaphor as a bit different than others.
Do you think that any of those representations of discipleship has kind of dominated, we'll just limit it to America, like contemporary American understandings of what discipleship means?
Hmm. I think a lot of us, in part due to our notions of traditional ideas of learning, probably gravitate towards Matthew's version of a learning from a teacher, whether or not it's an action reflection model. And all of that's good. There's value to that. I think there's a great deal of value to realizing the significance of these other models of what it means to follow Jesus, just to set out on a journey, to follow even when one doesn't understand, and to press questions, even skeptical ones, because these are as informative and um, richer to our thinking about what following Jesus looks like. That would make for a fuller understanding of what discipleship is versus a narrow one.
I think even though positionally most people are following most of the time, personally, professionally, I think it's a difficult thing for people to wrap their heads around. I think they'd like to see themselves more as leaders than
Hmm.
as followers,
Hmm.
and that's probably a pretty difficult challenge that you just posed to people.
Yeah, that's a great point. Uh,
um, Yeah, it's just at least again limited to America. Can't really speak for anywhere else, but yeah, follower is not always seen as a good thing. It's hard for people to see being called a follower as praise in American culture. Um,
Mm.
what would you recommend that listeners read, listen to, watch to get a better understanding of ancient travel, Luke's gospel, discipleship? Just go nuts on that.
Yeah. Although they're yeah, I've been thinking about that, and I mean, Loveday Alexander has a neat article on journeying in Luke and Acts. It's mostly Acts compared to journeys in antiquity. I've always kind of been inspired by that article. We talked earlier about salvation and what that looks like. I think Joel Green has lovely stuff on conversion in Luke and Acts and how it's iterative and it's related to discipleship. There's a lot of overlap. I was tempted to bring in a little bit more on the notion of conversion in Luke and Acts and see how it overlaps with notions of discipleship, but I didn't want to make it bigger than this article needed to be either. So yeah, Joel Green has really great stuff on conversion in Luke and Acts, as well as before him Beverly Gaventa. Um, and those are things that come to my mind. I also think that sometimes just reading. Uh, so this is kind of random, but I took a doctoral seminar and it was my PhD studies on the ancient novel at Princeton University, and that although it was pretty. It's kind of its own tangent. It also informed a lot of my thinking of how Luke can act as just basic narratives, how people would have received it compared to what was in circulation. What were the books out there? What were people reading, and how does that shape how people heard these writings? And it just changed some of my thinking about how people appreciated probably the sea journey, like in Acts. Or I think to bring it to a singular point, I think it informs. Uh, I think ancient readers enjoyed journeys, reading in their narratives. And I think Luke was attuned to that. And he didn't bring it in just for show, but I think it overlaps with some people's understandings and appreciations as readers and hearers. Um, I think Luke's metaphor of discipleship as a journey would have made a lot of sense to his early hearers and early audiences.
Are there novels from around this time that you think this is a really readable thing that will help people understand Luke or any of the other gospels or biblical texts?
There are definitely ancient novels. I don't know that I wouldn't say any of them are like carbon copy parallels, but um, uh, Calaroe is a well-known novel. You can get collections of these; they're out there in circulation. Um, and Xenophon has a few. Um, so there's some Greek novels that I think are make for some interesting comparisons. They're pretty different, and yet they have some similarities. Yeah, and they can be found. There's a couple that come to my mind initially.
Okay. I'll poke around and see if there's anything out there to add into the show notes because I think that might be a neat layer for people to add to, I don't know, a Bible study like from a literary point of view,
Yeah,
if people are interested in that.
and to be clear, like I'm not saying Luke and Acts are like ancient novels. They're definitely forms of history writing, but yet, let's be honest, just like today, people are familiar with certain kinds of writings that are out there and in circulation, and so Luke's hearers and readers also were familiar with certain things. And it's interesting to see to step out of the history genre per se and think about other things that people were familiar with and that would have been informative to people's expectations.
Yeah. What do you read for fun?
I like science fiction because it has it's a way to exit my regular world and enter a different world where the rules are different. I also find a lot of theological and philosophical principles at work in a lot of science fiction. And I like, I mean, you mentioned Lord of the Rings earlier. It's one of my favorite series. So kind of epic, kind of grand theme narratives and stories. I think those are a great time. So I usually look for stories that have kind of major plots of of significance of that are theological and philosophical, and that involve a good quest. So
In keeping with the theme of your article, What is there any sci-fi fantasy that you've read recently that you would recommend?
I have read, I'm drawing a blank on the guy's name now, a couple of books by author who wrote The Martian. Uh,
Andy Weir.
yeah, Andy Weir. So I've read a few of his, and he's a good writer. It's kind of fun to read. Um, and I haven't had a chance to get into much. Honestly, I haven't excelled at reading stuff for fun. Um, and I'm working at it a little bit more because I find that I'm a healthier person. I just read a lot of stuff that have nothing to do with, not just looking for mining a nugget for my next article or something like that. So, but that's something I read recently and enjoyed.
Look, the listeners are sick of hearing me recommend this, but Adrian Tchaikovsky has a series called Tyrant Philosophers, and there are a lot of religious and theological, well, just straight up religion and theology represented within this world that he's created. But there is also quite a bit of travel across the three books that are out so far, and I he said there's a fourth one coming out, and also it's a plug for the podcast. I got to interview him last week, so there'll be an episode in a few months. But what if you don't get to read for fun much? What do you do to decompress?
Oh, sure. I like playing music, playing a local band. That's been fun. It's something I've re-explored in the last 5, 10 years of my life. Um, yeah, I try to get out and play a couple of either percussion or guitar, do things, and uh, that'd be a central thing I've embraced and enjoyed doing. On my website, I think I name myself as a scholar, pastor, and a wannabe musician. So I guess that's the tail end of that.
But you actually play music. Doesn't sound like you just want to be a musician.
Well, that's kind of you, yeah. Um, and it's fun. It's fun to make music with other people, even more than I play. I go to an open mic night regularly in town, and although I can play songs by myself, it always just sounds a lot better, and I do it with someone else to try to find ways to work together. So that's a lot of fun.
That does sound fun. So I am curious, and I've been wondering while we've been talking. The books that are facing the camera. What are the books that are facing? Are those books or are those just images?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Behind me.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's real. That's real stuff. I can throw my pen at it. Yeah.
No, 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 no. I didn't mean as the bookcase. I mean the ones that are facing, like the covers are facing the camera. Are those books or are those just like icons or something?
Oh, you mean right? Those are icons.
Okay. Oh, yeah. I couldn't tell if they were book covers or not because I can't really make out if there was text on them. Okay. No, I was just going to ask you if those were books. What books are they? If they're prominently displayed like that, but no, those are okay. Those are cool. I like those.
An icon of Jesus and an icon of Lydia, and then the Trinity, Holy Trinity of Rublev. That's also an icon. I got a few others in other places, other spots in my office too. But yeah, they remind me of the sacredness of, the broader mystical communion, the Christian community that we're a part of, and that I'm not alone in this work.
That's a nice way to punctuate your book collection there. Okay. Well, unless you have anything else for us, I'm going to call this one good.
Yeah, this is a joy. It's fun to talk about this, Jared. I appreciate the questions, both scripted and planned, and those that come off the top
The
of your
ones,
head.
yeah, the ones I just pulled out of my head. Okay, man. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for your good work.
Thank you so much for listening. Next week on the podcast will be Ryan Chester, and we will be discussing another article over there. This one is about. We'll be discussing another article. I will let him get into that here in the preview that I'm about to play. Quick reminder, though, if you are listening for free, please follow us on social media. Shoot me an email at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com if you have any feedback for me. All one word, it means what it means at gmail.com. Guest suggestions. Hey, I hate this. Hey, I love this. I want to hear any of it. Any seriously considered feedback for the podcast is what I'm looking for there. In addition to that, you can hear this conversation that you're about to hear a preview of now for $5 a month. So jump on over to Patreon, drop $5 a month, and you can hear episodes 10 days before they come out for free. Hopefully more benefits will come up as I can think of what I have to offer people for $5 a month. If you get a chance to love someone, you should take it. Take care.
So now Nadab and Abihu, so to get to 10, 1-3, why this important? What we see is an act of violation which is somewhat unclear. The act of violation has to deal with an offering that is made by fire. And yet we also had offering by fires earlier. So we have an offering by fire that resulted in immediate talionic punishment, immediate talionic death. And then of course, then we have a speech that Moses gave from Yahweh. So Yahweh spoke to Moses, and it's a revelatory speech. And then after that, of course, we have the disposal of the bodies. But again, the importance of it is that these are the two sons of Aaron the high priest. He's got 4 total, and these are the first 2. Okay, so these who have been, they have been ordained in chapter 8. They have now been inducted and inaugurated in chapter 9, the beginning of the 8th day. And now they do something that is wrong. They're punished. And by that, Yahweh gives a declaration and makes an announcement. So that kind of sets the context of what's going on in 10, 1-3. And but also sets the context of what's going on, because they're still in the middle of their inauguration day, the 8th day. And the 8th, important because that represents like a new beginning. So the 8th day is a very important day of a new beginning. And what we find here is a new beginning, and already in that day of new beginning, there's a problem.